All right, so picture this. America, brand spanking new. We just fought this massive, expensive war, the American Revolution, winning freedom. Awesome. Paying for it? Not so awesome. The young United States was basically broke. Seriously, the national piggy bank was looking pretty empty. The states had racked up huge debts. The Continental Congress, which was kind of like the early government, had also borrowed a ton of money from foreign countries and its own citizens. We owed France, we owed the Netherlands, we owed American merchants and even soldiers who had fought in the war. It was a financial mess, a real economic headache for the founding fathers trying to get this new nation off the ground. This debt wasn't just some abstract number on a piece of paper. It was a real problem, a huge problem. How could a new nation gain respect on the world stage if it couldn't even pay its bills? Other countries would be hesitant to trade with us or lend us more money if they thought we were a bad investment. Imagine trying to get a loan for a new car when you still owe your friend $20 from last year, times a million. This financial instability threatened the very survival of the United States. If the government couldn't get its finances in order, the entire American experiment could collapse before it even really got started. That's a pretty high-stakes situation, right? So, the leaders of this new country, folks like George Washington and his crew, knew they had to do something. They couldn't just ignore the debt and hope it would magically disappear. That's not how economics works, unfortunately. They needed a plan, a way to consolidate all these different debts and start paying them off in a systematic way. This wasn't just about money. It was about building a credible, functioning government. It was about showing the world and their own citizens that the United States was here to stay and could manage its affairs responsibly. It was a monumental task, a true test of their leadership and vision for the future. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. This guy was a financial whiz, or at least he thought he was, and he had some big ideas. He believed that a strong national government needed strong finances. He proposed that the federal government should take over all the states' debts. This was a controversial idea because some states had already paid off a lot of their debt while others hadn't. But Hamilton argued it would bind the states closer to the federal government and establish the nation's creditworthiness. It was a bold move, and it set the stage for some serious debate, and as we'll see, some serious conflict. So, we've established America is drowning in debt. Alexander Hamilton, our financial guru, steps up. He's got this grand plan to get the country back on its feet. Part of this plan, taxes. I know, nobody likes taxes. But governments need money to function, to pay for things like armies, roads, and, well, paying off massive war debts. Hamilton looked around for things to tax, and his eyes landed on a popular product, whiskey. In 1791, Congress, at Hamilton's urging, passed an excise tax on distilled spirits. This was the first federal tax levied on a domestically produced product. A pretty big deal. Hamilton had a few reasons for choosing whiskey. First, he thought it would be a reliable source of revenue. People liked their whiskey, so they'd probably keep buying it, even with a small tax. Second, he saw it as a way to assert federal power. Remember, this was a new government. Some people were still skeptical about its authority. Making people pay a federal tax and enforcing that tax would show everyone that the national government was in charge. It was a bit of a power play, wrapped up in an economic necessity. He also believed it might encourage people to drink a little less, which he saw as a moral benefit, though that was probably a secondary concern. The tax was structured in a way that, on paper, seemed fair. It could be paid annually by large distillers at a flat rate, or by the gallon for smaller producers. However, this structure actually hit smaller producers harder. Large distillers in the East, who could produce and store large quantities, often got a better deal. They could afford the flat rate or had the infrastructure to deal with the per-gallon tax more efficiently. For them, it was just another cost of doing business. They had cash money to pay the tax collectors when they came knocking, which was a key difference compared to folks on the frontier. But this tax wasn't just about raising money or flexing federal muscles for Hamilton. He genuinely believed it was crucial for the nation's survival. In his report on public credit, he laid out his vision for a financially stable United States. He argued that establishing good credit was essential for borrowing money in the future, for national security, and for economic growth. The whiskey tax was a key component of this broader financial architecture he was trying to build. He thought it was a necessary, if perhaps unpopular, step towards a stronger, more unified nation. He probably didn't anticipate just how unpopular it would become in certain parts of the country. Now let's shift our focus westward to places like western Pennsylvania. Life on the frontier in the late 18th century was tough, really tough. These were rugged, isolated communities. Farmers grew crops like corn and rye, but getting these bulky grains to markets back east was a nightmare. The roads were terrible, sometimes just muddy tracks. Transporting grain over the Appalachian Mountains was expensive and impractical. Imagine trying to haul a wagon full of corn hundreds of miles over rough terrain. It just wasn't worth it. So what did these resourceful frontier farmers do? They distilled their grain into whiskey. Whiskey was like liquid gold on the frontier. It was much easier and cheaper to transport than bushels of grain. A horse could carry only a few bushels of rye, but it could carry the equivalent of many more bushels once that rye was distilled into whiskey. So it became a key commodity for trade. But it was more than just that. Whiskey often served as a form of currency. In areas where official money was scarce, people used whiskey to barter for goods and services. You might pay the blacksmith with a jug of whiskey or buy supplies. From a traveling peddler, it was an integral part of the local economy. The whiskey tax, from the perspective of these frontier distillers, felt incredibly unfair and discriminatory. They weren't rich. Many were small-scale farmers who distilled their surplus grain to make ends meet, not to build massive fortunes. The tax had to be paid in cash, but cash was scarce on the frontier. They bartered with whiskey, not dollars. So finding actual currency to pay the tax was a huge burden. It felt like the distant federal government, dominated by Eastern elites, didn't understand their way of life and was unfairly targeting them. They saw it as an attack on their livelihood. Furthermore, many of these frontier folks were veterans of the Revolutionary War. They had fought against British taxation without representation. Now it felt like their own new government was doing something similar. They were far from the centers of power, and they felt their voices weren't being heard. The tax collectors were seen as intrusive agents of a far-off authority. For them, this wasn't just about money, it was about fairness, about economic survival, and about the principles they believed they had fought for. The whiskey tax wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a threat to their entire way of life and their hard-won independence. So Hamilton's whiskey tax is now law, and out on the frontier people are not happy at all. The initial reactions in western Pennsylvania and other frontier areas were ones of outrage and defiance. Remember, these folks felt targeted. They saw the tax as an unfair burden imposed by a distant government that didn't understand their economic realities. Their primary product, their main source of cash or barter equivalent, was suddenly being taxed. It felt like a direct hit to their already precarious financial situations. They had just fought a war over taxation, and for many, this felt like history repeating itself, but with a new antagonist. The protests started relatively peacefully, at least at first. There were meetings, petitions, and resolutions passed condemning the tax. People gathered in towns and villages to voice their discontent. They argued that the tax was unconstitutional, that it favored large eastern distillers, and that it would ruin small producers. These gatherings were a way for communities to express their shared grievances and try to organize a collective response. They hoped that if they made enough noise, the federal government might reconsider or repeal the tax. They were trying to use the political process, as they understood it, to fight back against what they saw as an injustice. However, tax collectors appointed by the federal government soon found themselves in a very difficult and often dangerous position. Many were met with hostility and intimidation. It wasn't easy to convince a frontier farmer who barely had any cash to hand over money for a tax he deeply resented. Some tax collectors were threatened, others were ostracized by their communities. Imagine being the guy whose job it is to take money from your already struggling neighbors for a law they all hate. It was not a popular career choice on the frontier in the early 1790s, to say the least. This resistance made enforcing the law incredibly challenging. The early resistance also took on symbolic forms, just like during the lead-up to the Revolution. Protesters used methods that echoed earlier struggles against British authority. They raised liberty poles, symbols of defiance. They formed committees of correspondence to coordinate their efforts across different communities. There was a strong sense that they were defending their rights and freedoms, much like they had against the British. The rhetoric was very much about liberty versus tyranny. This wasn't just a simple disagreement over economic policy, it was framed as a fundamental conflict over the nature of government and individual rights, making it a very potent and emotional issue for those involved. Section 5. Things get heated, tar, feathers and fiery tempers. You know, the initial grumbling and peaceful protests against the whiskey tax didn't stay peaceful for long. As the federal government continued to insist on collecting the tax, frustrations on the frontier boiled over. The situation in western Pennsylvania in particular began to escalate pretty dramatically. We're talking about a shift from angry meetings and petitions to outright violence and intimidation. The rebels, as they were becoming known, felt that their peaceful pleas were being ignored by the distant federal government, so they decided to ramp up their tactics. This is where things start to get really messy and, well, a bit scary for those trying to enforce the law. One of the uglier forms of protest that re-emerged was the practice of tarring and feathering. This was a brutal and humiliating form of mob justice used during the revolution against British officials and loyalists. Now, federal tax collectors and those who complied with the whiskey tax became the targets. Imagine being stripped, covered in hot tar and then coated in feathers. It was painful, disfiguring, and designed to strike fear into anyone associated with the tax. These weren't isolated incidents, they happened multiple times, sending a clear message that the federal government's authority was not welcome here. This was a serious breakdown of law and order. The most significant flashpoint, the event that really pushed things towards a major confrontation, was the attack on the home of General John Neville. Neville was the regional inspector of the excise for western Pennsylvania. He was a prominent local figure, a Revolutionary War veteran, but his job made him a prime target for the rebels' anger. In July 1794, a group of armed men, initially seeking to serve a mock warrant, surrounded his fortified home, Bower Hill. Shots were exchanged, and one rebel was killed. The next day, a much larger force, numbering perhaps 500 to 700 men, returned with a vengeance. They were not playing around. The attack on Bower Hill turned into a full-blown siege. Neville had requested protection, and a small detachment of soldiers from Fort Pitt was there to defend the property, but they were vastly outnumbered. After a fierce firefight, during which the outbuildings were set ablaze and the rebel leader James McFarland, another Revolutionary War veteran, was killed, Neville's defenders were forced to surrender. The rebels then looted and burned Neville's mansion to the ground. This was a direct assault on a federal official and federal authority. It was an act of open insurrection, and it sent shockwaves all the way to Philadelphia, the nation's capital at the time. The government couldn't ignore this. Section 6, Washington steps in. Enough is enough. News of the attack on General Neville's home and the growing unrest in western Pennsylvania reached President George Washington and his cabinet in Philadelphia. This was a serious crisis. It wasn't just a few disgruntled farmers anymore, it was an armed uprising challenging the authority of the newly formed federal government. Washington, the guy who led the country through the revolution, was now faced with the prospect of using force against his own citizens. This was a deeply troubling situation for him and for the young nation. He knew he had to act decisively, or the federal government might be seen as weak and ineffective. Washington consulted with his advisors, including Alexander Hamilton, who, as you can imagine, was a strong advocate for a firm response. Hamilton had pushed for the tax, and he believed that the government's credibility was on the line. If they backed down now, it would set a dangerous precedent. Other groups might think they could defy federal laws whenever they disagreed with them. Washington, though perhaps more cautious initially, ultimately agreed. He believed that the survival of the Republic depended on the government's ability to enforce its laws. He couldn't let a regional rebellion undermine the entire federal structure they had worked so hard to create. So, what did Washington do? He decided to invoke the Militia Act of 1792. This act gave the president the authority to call up state militias to suppress insurrections and enforce federal law. First, as required by the law, he issued a proclamation on August 7, 1794. This proclamation commanded the insurgents in western Pennsylvania to disperse and return to their homes by September 1st. He warned them of the consequences if they failed to comply. It was essentially a final warning, a chance for the rebels to back down before things escalated further. He was giving them an out, but he was also making it clear he was prepared to use force. When the deadline passed and the rebels hadn't dispersed, Washington made his move. He called upon the governors of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia to raise a militia force of nearly 13,000 men. Think about that number. It was roughly the size of the Continental Army that had fought the British. This was not going to be a small police action. This was a major military mobilization. Washington was sending a very clear message. The federal government would not tolerate open rebellion. He was determined to show that the laws of the United States would be obeyed by force if necessary. The stage was set for a major confrontation. Section 7, the Watermelon Army marches, a show of federal might. With the decision made to suppress the rebellion, the call went out for militia troops. Governors scrambled to assemble their forces. This was a huge logistical undertaking. Nearly 13,000 men were mobilized from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia. This was a significant army, especially considering the context of the young nation. Some historians note that this force was comparable in size to the army Washington had commanded at times during the Revolution. The sheer scale of the mobilization was intended to be overwhelming, to demonstrate the federal government's capacity and resolve without necessarily having to engage in a massive battle. President George Washington himself, in an extraordinary move, decided to lead the troops, at least for part of the journey. This was unprecedented. The sitting president of the United States, the hero of the Revolution, was personally taking command of an army to put down a domestic uprising. His presence lent immense authority and gravity to the expedition. He rode out with the troops, reviewing them and overseeing their preparations. This sent a powerful signal both to the rebels and to the nation as a whole. It underscored the seriousness of the situation and Washington's personal commitment to upholding federal law. Alexander Hamilton also accompanied the expedition, eager to see his policies enforced. The march of this large federalized militia towards western Pennsylvania was in itself a major event. As the troops advanced, word spread quickly. The rebels, who had perhaps underestimated the federal government's determination, began to realize the seriousness of their predicament. The approaching army was not some small posse of local sheriffs. It was a formidable military force led by the most respected figure in the country. This show of force had an immediate psychological impact. The sight of thousands of soldiers marching to enforce the law was a sobering one for those who had defied it. Some sources mockingly called it the Watermelon Army due to the lateness of the season and the provisions, but its purpose was deadly serious. The progress of the army was relatively slow but steady. They advanced through Pennsylvania, a visible symbol of federal power extending its reach into the rebellious western counties. There was a sense of anticipation and tension. Would the rebels stand and fight? Would there be a bloody confrontation? The government hoped that the sheer size and presence of the army would be enough to quell the uprising without significant bloodshed. Washington's strategy was as much about intimidation and demonstrating resolve as it was about direct military engagement. He wanted to restore order, but ideally with minimal loss of life. The march itself was a critical part of that strategy. Section 8, the rebellion crumbles. Fizzle, not bang. As the massive federalized militia with Washington at its head for a time marched deeper into western Pennsylvania, the Whiskey Rebellion essentially began to evaporate. The resolve of the rebels, which had seemed so strong when they were burning down tax inspectors' homes, started to waver in the face of overwhelming federal power. There was no climactic battle, no Lexington and Concord of the Whiskey Rebellion. Instead, the organized resistance pretty much dissolved. Most of the rebels saw the writing on the wall. Confronting a well-equipped army of nearly 13,000 men was a far cry from intimidating, isolated tax collectors. By the time the federal troops arrived in the rebellious counties in late October 1794, many of the key leaders of the uprising had already fled. Others simply went home, hoping to blend back into the population and avoid arrest. The show of force had worked. The rebellion collapsed without a major fight. Federal authorities then began the process of rounding up suspected insurgents. About 150 men were arrested, though most were later released due to lack of evidence or for other reasons. It wasn't a wholesale crackdown, but the government was keen to make an example of some of the ringleaders to deter future rebellions. Only a relatively small number of individuals were actually brought to trial. Of these, just 2 men, John Mitchell and Philip Weigel, were convicted of treason. Treason! That's a serious charge. However, President Washington, in a display of clemency and a desire to heal the nation's wounds, eventually pardoned them both. He understood that harsh punishments might only breed more resentment. His goal was to reassert federal authority, not to create martyrs or further alienate the western frontier. The pardons were a strategic move to promote national reconciliation after a very tense and divisive episode. It showed both the strength and the mercy of the federal government. So, the Great Whiskey Rebellion ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, or perhaps, more accurately, with the thud of marching federal boots. While there were some initial confrontations like the attack on Bower Hill, the main battle was won by the demonstration of federal might rather than through extensive combat. The whiskey tax itself remained difficult to collect in many frontier areas for some time and was eventually repealed by Thomas Jefferson's administration. But the immediate crisis of open defiance to federal law had been overcome. The federal government had faced its first major internal challenge and had, in a very visible way, prevailed. Section 9. So what's the big deal? The Whiskey Rebellion's legacy. So the Whiskey Rebellion fizzled out, a few guys got arrested, a couple got pardoned. Why do we still talk about it? Well, it was a huge deal for the young United States. This was the first major test of the federal government's power under the new Constitution. Could this new government actually enforce its laws, especially when faced with popular opposition? The Articles of Confederation, our first attempt at a government, had been super weak. Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts a few years earlier had highlighted that weakness. The Whiskey Rebellion was a chance for the Constitution to prove it was stronger, and it did. The successful suppression of the rebellion demonstrated that the federal government had both the authority and the will to enforce its laws, even in the face of armed resistance. This was crucial for establishing its credibility both domestically and internationally. It showed that the United States was not going to fall apart into a bunch of squabbling regions. President Washington's decisive action, leading troops at least part of the way, sent a clear message: laws passed by the federal government would be upheld. This set a vital precedent for federal supremacy in areas of national law, a cornerstone of how the US government functions even today. However, the Whiskey Rebellion also had other, perhaps less intended consequences. It deepened the growing political divisions in the country. The Federalist Party, led by Hamilton and Adams, generally supported the strong federal response. They saw it as necessary for maintaining order and national unity. But the emerging Democratic-Republican Party, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, was more sympathetic to the concerns of the Western farmers. They worried about the expansion of federal power and the potential for government overreach. The handling of the rebellion became another point of contention between these budding political factions, shaping early American political debate. Ultimately, the Whiskey Rebellion was a critical moment in American history. It clarified the power of the federal government, but it also highlighted the ongoing tensions between central authority and individual liberty, and between different regional interests. It showed that the new government could act decisively, but also that it needed to be mindful of the concerns of its citizens, especially those on the fringes. The tax itself was eventually repealed, suggesting that while the government could enforce unpopular laws, public opinion and political pressure still mattered. It was a messy, complicated affair, but one that fundamentally shaped the course of American governance. And that, as they say, is something worth knowing.